am just so pleased to introduce Theresa Cardinal Brown, who is now a senior advisor on immigration and border policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, where she was managing director of immigration and cross-border policy for 9 years. She has broad expertise in immigration policy. She's worked at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and the Department of Homeland Security. So her insights and clear thinking has led her to be a very sought-after spokesperson on national news sources such as NPR, the PBS NewsHour, and also in the New York Times. So what our format is we're going to have a 45-minute or so conversation presentation during which Susan Martin, who's also a member of the steering committee, but herself a longtime expert on immigration, and I will pose some questions to Theresa, and then this will be followed by the Q&A. So I believe I have the first question, which is, Theresa, would you tell us about your work at the Bipartisan Policy Center and why there is a need for bipartisanship in the immigration area?
Well, thank you, Jane. Thank you, Susan. And thank you to all the League of Women Voters for inviting me this evening. I'm very happy to be speaking with you all. So the Bipartisan Policy Center is a think tank in Washington, D.C. It is by name and intention bipartisan. So what we try to do is bring together Republicans and Democrats and have them, with some help from our experts, work out where they think they can come to agreement on some of the hardest issues that the United States has to deal with. We are a multi-issue organization. So we have projects that deal with energy, with housing, with the economy, with finance, with technology, with business, with healthcare, as I said, some of the, and of course, immigration. The work that I've done at the Bipartisan Policy Center and that BPC itself has done includes a series of recommendations from a task force that we formed in 2013 that was co-chaired by former RNC and DNC chairs Haley Barbour and Ed Rendell, and former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Henry Cisneros. We came out with a series of recommendations in 2013 and again in 2016 for comprehensive immigration reform. These were reforms that this bipartisan task force led by those eminences were able to come to agreement on. In 2017, they also made recommendations for how to deal with the status of Dreamers in the United States. In general, the Bipartisan Policy Center and the work of the task force has supported immigration reform that helps the economy, that reforms our employment-based immigration system to help meet needs in the United States, that provides an earned pathway to legal status for those who are undocumented in the United States, and finds ways to better manage and secure our borders and reduce the future of illegal immigration to the United States. Those are the broad pillars that the task force has agreed on. Since those documents, the staff at the BPC and myself, we have convened lots of different working groups with lots of different perspective and come out with recommendations for redefining border security, for relooking at the employment-based immigration system. We have studied immigration at the state level and what different state legislatures have done that are Republican or Democrat or divided, and where there are commonalities there. So we conduct polling on various aspects of immigration to try to find common ground among Americans and American voters, to see how that can be used to help influence our legislators to work. To second part of your question, why do I think that immigration needs bipartisanship? I think it's the same reason that any part of our immigration or our legal system, or frankly, any big issue we want to tackle should be bipartisan. And the fundamental reason is that when you can get people to agree, the broader the agreement, the more likely that policy is to have lasting impact and lasting effect, and not try to be undone by the other party when they might gain power. It tends to be more durable. Some of our biggest policy successes in this country have come from bipartisan support, things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the legalization in 1986, which was Democrats in Congress and a Republican president that signed it. I think increasingly, because we are looking at such close divisions in our Congress, even when one party may have quote unquote control, like happened in the last 2 years, they have a bare majority, and you know, maybe a handful of seats separate the majority from the minority in the Senate or the House. And that means that it's very, very difficult to pass things without getting bipartisan support. We're already seeing that in the Republicans in the House, where they have trouble getting all of the Republicans to agree on one thing. The Democrats had difficulty getting all the Democrats to agree on things that they wanted to do last year and last Congress. So again, I think you're more likely to have success if you're able to build that majority from the middle, rather than working from the most extreme positions inward. What tends to happen then is, for every vote you might be able to pick up across the aisle, you're going to lose some of the you know, people on the outermost flank of your own party. And if you're trying to build majorities, it's better to try from the middle. So those are my rationales for why I think we need bipartisanship.
Thank you. Having been a part of 2 bipartisan federal commissions, I can attest to the importance of the work that you do. And it's hard to get immigration policy through the Congress anyway, but when it is considered a partisan issue, it's certainly a whole lot more difficult.
Yeah.
But let me start my questioning with the elephant in the room, and that's the migration crisis at the border. And first of all, is it indeed a crisis? And also, what do you think about the recent policies that the administration has been proposing? The comments on the latest rule are actually due today on that. So has he found an acceptable balance between enforcement and protection for refugees and asylum seekers? Is it a formula that may work to reduce tensions on the border? And could you tell our audience a little bit more about what those policies are?
Sure. So let me start by saying I have called it a crisis for many years, and I don't think the crisis started when President Biden was elected. I think the crisis actually started way back during the Obama administration. And it is a humanitarian crisis. It is a migration crisis, and it is a security crisis. All 3 things happen simultaneously at our borders. And when we are unable to manage any one of those things, it has impacts for the other things that have to be managed at our borders. And I think, you know, me saying the crisis started in 2014, that was when we first saw what was to become, and I think is definitely now, a fundamental shift in what migration looks like at the US-Mexico border that is not likely to revert to its prior situation. So let me explain what that means. For most of the time, the United States has been monitoring the US-Mexico border for migration, which goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. The vast majority, 90+% of everybody that was ever encountered trying to come into the country without authorization was Mexican, mostly single adult males, and mostly coming seeking work. And that meant that we developed legal processes, infrastructure, resources, personnel to process what was predominantly a Mexican flow, and most of whom were immediately returnable to Mexico. If you entered between the port of entry, you are by definition deportable. There are slight exceptions for that relief, and those relate to asylum, but most of the Mexicans for most of that time were not asking for asylum. Asylum was limited to very, very small proportion of those who came to the US-Mexico border. And most of them would come through a port of entry if they intended to seek asylum. So it was not an issue for the Border Patrol. Starting in 2014, and actually it preceded 2014, but 2014 is when I think it hit the headlines. We saw a shift and a significant number. When I say a significant number, up to 30% of who was being encountered at the border were unaccompanied children or families from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Now, why was this a difficulty? Well, the first difficulty was that they were not Mexican, which meant that we weren't able to immediately return them to Mexico if they were not eligible for asylum. So we had to take them into custody. They had to be in custody in border protection and border patrol facilities, and then transferred to immigration and customs enforcement facilities, from whence they could be determined if they were eligible to apply for asylum or were going to be deported back home. But they started arriving in such numbers that our small border patrol facilities along some of these remote portions of the border, such as southeastern Texas and the Rio Grande Valley or the Boot Heel of New Mexico, were quickly overwhelmed. They did not have places to keep and hold vulnerable people like children or parents with very small infants or families in any sort of reasonable accommodation. And so that's when we first saw the Obama administration start developing and building at the border these processing facilities. And to maintain separation between unrelated adults and children, they separated these large processing areas by chain link fences. And that's where we first started seeing the idea of kids in cages. It was during the Obama administration. Since then, migration at the border has continued to shift. We saw huge increases in the arrivals of families during the Trump administration. When COVID hit, the numbers went down. Post-COVID, and actually during COVID, they started increasing again late 2020, and we started seeing more nationalities arrive. Through the Biden administration now, we have seen significant increases in Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans who have been migrating throughout the hemisphere in the last few years and made their way to the United States. We're now seeing increases in the number of Peruvians and Ecuadorians. And just in the last several weeks, big increases in the number of Chinese we see at the border that are trying to come to the United States. Now, almost all of them now are asking for asylum. And that has created an inability for our asylum process at the border, which was designed for a tiny percentage of people, to process them. So we have record numbers of backlogs of asylum cases in our immigration courts. We have record numbers of cases in our immigration courts. We can't necessarily return people back to their home countries, particularly countries like Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua that we don't have great diplomatic relations with. And so the only thing the administration could really do was release them into the United States to await an immigration court hearing to decide if they get asylum. So what the Biden administration ultimately tried to do was mix what I would call enforcement mechanisms with legal options, predominantly for these nationalities that we were not able to send back to their home countries, the Cubans, Haitian, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. And they created a parole program that would allow US people to sponsor migrants from those countries who would be flown to the United States and admitted on something called humanitarian parole for 2 years, would be eligible for work authorization. And in conjunction with that, anybody who arrived other than through that program could be returned back to Mexico under the COVID authorities called Title 42. So Mexico agreed to take them back. That has significantly reduced migration from those nationalities and from all migration since they were announced in January. Now, we're only a couple months in, so I think it's too soon to declare any kind of victory, because what we have seen over the last decade now, or almost decade, is that migration patterns frequently change in response to various policy shifts. Most of these changes are somewhat temporary. We have not seen, permanent changes, but I think that the Biden administration is at least attempting to manage what had become an increasingly unmanageable set of arrivals to the border. And that was creating not only difficulties at the border, but the large number of releases into communities along the border. The transportation of some of those to other cities in the country created difficulties for those other cities that were receiving them. So I think that this is a temporary fix. I don't think it's permanent. One thing is that the reason most people are claiming asylum is that if you get asylum, you can't be deported. Now, whether or not everybody arriving at the border has a valid asylum claim, it's doubtful. It's doubtful. And I say that only because overall, most asylum claims historically in the United States are denied. Now, it varies a lot by nationality, and obviously every case is its own animal, but the overall rate of approval for most asylum cases is about 30%. So we know that most of the people arriving probably will not be eligible for asylum, even if they are fleeing horrible conditions and even if they are very desperate. But these parole programs make no provision for deciding whether or not they are truly eligible for asylum before putting them here on parole. And it's up to them to then file a case. Unlike people that had been arriving at the border, or at least they were putting a process with the immigration courts. It may take a long time, but they're in a process to decide that. And so I don't think parole is a permanent option. It's also been litigated now. States along the border have sued to end this program because they believe it's an abuse of parole authorities. And so I think that's another reason why it's been a very big challenge for every administration since President Obama to manage this. Every policy that every president has put in place to try to do so has resulted in litigation. And that has meant judges are deciding what policies can and cannot be used to try to manage things at the border. And that has, I think, exacerbated some of the chaos that we're seeing.
Thank you. Jane?
Yeah. Yes, we could probably talk about that topic all evening.
There's probably a lot more to say.
Yes. I'm going to shift us back to some of the potential for legislation. So there has been considerable bipartisan support for some of the proposals before Congress, in particular, the DREAM Act, the Farm Worker Bill. There are several others, but those are, I think, probably two of the top ones. Do you see any likelihood that any of these could pass in this Congress? And I'll add one little follow-up, which is a toughening of the border enforcement the sine qua non for legalization of dreamers and others?
Yeah. So you're right. Most of those bills that you have talked about have had significant bipartisan support in the past, at least in terms of co-sponsorship. I would say the other bills that I would put in that category, there's an Afghan Adjustment Act that would allow those Afghans who were evacuated to the United States and admitted on parole during the end of our U.S. presence in Afghanistan, would allow them to adjust to permanent status. Right now, they have to try to find their own way either through asylum or special immigrant visas or other provisions of law to get green cards, and that's likely to take a long time, and some of them may not qualify. So there's a big bipartisan push to adjust Afghans in the United States. There's a burgeoning push to look at the Ukrainians as well, although I think that's a little less fully out there yet. There hasn't been legislation introduced on that as far as I know. A couple of other things that have gotten bipartisan support, bills that would recapture unused immigrant visas from the past to support healthcare workers to immigrate to the United States. That was a bill that got quite a bit of bipartisan support in the last Congress and the previous Congress, especially during the height of COVID. There has been bipartisan support for bills that would reallocate the country limits on permanent immigration. Right now, every country in the world gets the same number of slots of immigrant visas. And it doesn't matter if the country is as large a country population with as much demand as India or as small a country as Bhutan. They all get the same number of visas. And what that means is that the countries that have more people applying have much, much longer wait times before they're eligible to actually get a green card. And that's caused a lot of, I think, some call it discrimination among countries because of this. All of those bills have had bipartisan support in the past, but none of them have been enacted so far. And I think part of the reason for that is that even though there's majority support, not only in Congress, but in the country for many of these bills, the politics of the issue, particularly electoral politics, mitigate against the parties really working together to pass it. So this is a point at which, leaders of the parties are looking at some of their most vulnerable members, where the seats might switch in the next election, and is a vote on this bill going to help or hurt them? We already have seen immigration become a big issue in political advertising and attacks between the parties. I think most of it is coming from the Republican side, and certainly against the border, against Democrats, but Democrats have also had their share of sort of going after Republicans for blocking various types of legislation. And they're finding it electorally advantageous in some circumstances, or they believe it to be electorally advantageous. And that mitigates against actually passing legislation. I think the other thing is that Congress right now is working not in a very bipartisan way on anything. Or rarely. I think the last Congress had probably more bipartisan legislation enacted than has happened in quite a long time, but even that was challenging. And, I think that what tends to happen is, as I mentioned, the parties try to work to consolidate all of their own party and then see what other members on the other side are willing to do. And oftentimes it's not really about negotiating what can pass and get a majority of votes, but kind of shaming the other side into voting along with you in some ways. And that doesn't work very well. So the bills that we've talked about are all bills that have had bipartisan members working together, much like we try to do at the Bipartisan Policy Center, to figure out where they have areas of agreement. They're proposing things that are not, this is everything my party would want or everything somebody would want and nothing of yours. It's very much sort of a moderate in the middle take at most of these things. And yet it's difficult because the leadership is not necessarily willing to get or vote on things that don't have a majority of their own party on board. And so that's the challenge of getting it enacted. So I think the odds are relatively slim in a divided Congress that we will see any significant immigration legislation pass. Slim is not zero. And I do know that there are bipartisan groups of members who are right now talking to each other about border legislation, about legalization, about some of these employment-based things. The farm worker legislation is perennial. It will be back. There's, I think, a pent-up demand by a lot of members to try to see if they can get things done. And there's a growing frustration at the breakdowns in the immigration system that's bipartisan. But I think your last point is really the key one. Right now, all of those things are taking a backseat to what's happening at the border. And for better or for worse, for most of the public in the United States, what happens at the border colors how they feel about immigration broadly. And it's very hard to see Congress moving on anything, legalization, DREAM Act, farm workers, anything, unless it contains a significant component of trying to address the situation at the border. The challenge is going to be, unlike these other issues where I think everyone is pretty much solidly aware of where the bipartisan consensus lies and what policies can get a majority vote, I don't think that's there on the border right now. We're seeing it because the Republicans tried immediately at the beginning of this Congress to pass a border bill that would pretty much shut off access to asylum at all for anyone at the border, would allow states to sue the Department of Homeland Security if they felt the border was not secure. I mean, it was a very stringent bill. And they couldn't get all the Republicans on side to approve it. Border Republicans in Texas opposed it. And so they had to pull that bill from the floor. And now it's trying to go through committee, and they are trying to get it merged with other bills. And they are looking at, I think, what are much more rational and reasonable solutions. At least among the Republicans, they're negotiating this. It's unclear whether the Democrats will go along with any of that. That having been said, I know there are Democrats looking for solutions that they feel they can support. And we know that the Senate has a bipartisan group that has been working for 2 years to try to develop border legislation. But I think that the situation is so fluid and it's so vexing that figuring out those solutions that can get bipartisan agreement is difficult. And again, right now, at least, certainly for the Republicans, they see the border as an electorally powerful issue with which to go after, particularly President Biden. And so that doesn't create an atmosphere to really help get legislation across the line that that president is going to have to sign. So we'll see.
Thank you. What your insights and breadth of experience are so helpful.
Yeah.
Over to Susan.
Yeah, well, I'm going to actually go to a later question I was going to ask, because I think it's a perfect follow-up for what you've been saying. And that's basically, most immigration advocates over the years have been pushing for comprehensive immigration reform, wanting to look at every aspect and all into one bill, partly because it's needed and partly because I think that it's been thought to be the only way to get reform. But has the comprehensive immigration reform become the enemy of the good? Is it undermining the efforts to get these other bills that have bipartisan support passed, or should we still be putting our focus on comprehensive?
I think that is a question under debate right now in many parts of the community that wants to see immigration reform. As you know, Susan, comprehensive immigration reform was an idea that started in the late 1990s. And the idea was that you wanted to deal with all the parts of the immigration system. It sat on 3 legs, this stool. One was legalization, one was border, and one was reforming the legal immigration system for future migration to the United States. Those were the 3 big issues. And there were lots of details in all of them. And we had several bills over the course of the early part of this century that tried to do that. We were talking before we all started, George W. Bush came into office in 2000 with a desire to see comprehensive immigration reform done. He worked very closely with his counterpart in Mexico. He brought together the Chamber and the AFL-CIO and some of the largest civil rights organizations at the time, the National Council of La Raza. There was a big hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee on September 9th, 2001, with those 3 witnesses saying, we all agree we think Congress should get comprehensive immigration reform done. Of course, 2 days later, 9/11, and that set things off. But to his credit, President Bush did not leave it. And he came back to the issue in 2005 and 2006 after the formation of the Department of Homeland Security. He worked closely with Senators McCain and Kennedy and others to try to push comprehensive immigration reform through Congress. There were significant and very close votes in 2007 and 2008, but ultimately it didn't pass. The next attempt, of course, was during the Obama administration. In 2013, the Senate passed a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform bill that was negotiated by a so-called gang of 8, 4 Republican and 4 Democratic senators. And it was widely expected the House was going to take it up. The Speaker of the House, John Boehner, agreed that immigration reform is necessary. It probably would have been a slightly different bill, but he started getting a lot of pushback from the Tea Party members of his conference. And after his number 2, Eric Cantor, lost a primary contest in Virginia in 2014, partly, at least people believed, because he was seen as soft on immigration. The bill just never moved in the House. Eventually, John Boehner was ousted. His successor, Paul Ryan, tried again to see if he could bring his party together with Democrats to pass something in the House, and it never happened. So at that point, I think a lot of people thought the idea of comprehensive immigration reform was dead. The idea of comprehensive immigration reform was not just, as you mentioned, because all the parts of the immigration system work together as a system and they have impacts on each other. If you're going to reform the legal immigration system, that's one way to address the needs in the country for our economy, but it also comes with a desire to kind of enforce the rules at the border. We want to reduce illegal immigration. And then, you know, those people who have been here living in the country for a long period of time and have kind of proven themselves that they're okay, and you know, we might as well find a way for them to get a legal status. Like, all of that was good. But I think the bigger reason that comprehensive immigration reform was tried was political. The idea was that you would broaden the number of interest groups that had skin in this game, that you would create a big tent of advocates, of civil rights organizations, of labor unions, of business advocates, of people who, each of whom had something in this bill they really wanted, and everybody was pushing to get it done. And then that translated to members of Congress, right? Members of Congress all had something in it that they saw that they wanted. The problem was that many of them also saw something they didn't like. And the bills were so big and very, very negotiated to like where the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted, that any small change kind of made the whole house of cards fall apart. And that certainly happened in 2007 with a vote to take out temporary worker programs, for example, which lost the support of the business community. In 2013, you know, the Senate had to add a whole lot of border security to get that bipartisan vote. There were some Democrats that were not comfortable with that. And it's not clear that the House would have, you know, that the House version wouldn't have added more that could have caused it to fail. So, you know, I think the challenges of immigration are there, whether it's comprehensive or narrow. And I kind of described some of them earlier. And it hasn't been any easier to get some of these smaller bills across the finish line either. And I think that's causing a lot of consternation. I think people are actively going, okay, what's it going to take? And I think there's a lot of different reasons. I already mentioned some of the political will and electoral reasons why it's difficult to get immigration reform done. I would also just argue that some of it is immigration is a serious issue for some people, but not everybody. It doesn't have like the broad intensity of some other issues. People vote on immigration, but not as their number 1, 2, or 3 issue for the most part. And there are a lot of polls that support this, by the way. I'm not just talking about this. Polling that we've done, polling by Gallup, polling by Pew, always ask about how important is immigration to you. And it's usually in the top 5. It's rarely the top 1 or 2. And where it is most important, the people who have the most intense feelings about it tend to be Republicans and tend to be hardcore on security. And so that influences a lot of how that party moves. On the Democratic side, there's lower intensity on immigration writ large, even though I think there's more cohesiveness in terms of policy solutions. Democrats on the whole tend to be much more pro-immigration, but it's not the biggest issue for them. And so it doesn't motivate Democrats or their voters as much as it does Republicans. And I think that's a political problem that extends to Congress. And it's not unique to immigration, but it is one of the reasons I think why immigration has been harder to get done.
Yeah, actually, as an historian, I can tell you that it's usually about 50 years in between any significant immigration reform legislation. It takes forever.
It takes a very long time. And I think one of the things, and you know, I haven't researched this, but sort of my theory is that things have to get extraordinarily bad, extraordinarily bad to motivate everybody to fix it rather than blame the other guy for it. And I think we're getting close to that. I think we have seen 3 successive administrations struggle very mightily to deal with what is frankly a paradigm shift in migration in the hemisphere, not just at our border, but throughout the whole hemisphere and frankly around the world, and not succeeding very well. I mean, I think Republicans would say that President Trump succeeded, but I think the numbers don't bear it out. I mean, one of the things that reduced numbers substantially during his administration was the beginning of COVID, when everybody sort of just paused and stayed put. Borders were closed for quite a long time. But the numbers started going up in May of 2020 and continued through the election and into the beginning of President Biden's term. Now they've gone up substantially since then, but I don't think that President Trump can alone sort of claim credit for fixing the border during his tenure, which I think some Republicans are saying. And it's not clear that the measures he put in place would have been long lasting. But I think that combined with the fact that our legal immigration system is very, very much suffering right now of a lack of adjudication, record number of cases at USCIS of legal immigration, people wanting green cards and work visas and employment authorization, can't get them through the system. The State Department, because it's shut down for pretty much 2 years, oversees all of its consular officers, has a huge backlog of immigrant visas and other visas that people have been waiting to come to the United States for. That resulted in a significant decline in immigration to the United States in the last 2 years that we're unlikely to make up. And that's contributing to demographic issues that we're looking at in the next 20 or 30 years. I can go into that if you want, but I just think that there's a level at which the entire system is sort of in a state of collapse right now. Everything from the border to the immigration courts to our legal immigration system to consular officers overseas, nothing is functioning. Our refugee system. And so I think we may be at that point where it's so bad that people have to really think solidly about solutions.
Theresa,
over to you.
sort of a follow-up. What role do you think the business community could play in pushing forward immigration reform, given that the workforce needs are an issue and are only going to get worse given the demographics? And are there business groups or coalitions that are important in this work? I've heard recently about the American Business Immigration Coalition, the Alliance for a New Immigration Consensus. Can you give us some thoughts on the business community?
So I would say that the business community has been involved in immigration reform for many decades. And it has, I would say that they've sort of waxed and waned in how hard they've been pushing. I was at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it was a #1 issue for the chamber in the early part of the 20th century. They were actively pushing for comprehensive immigration reform throughout that 2006, 2007, 2008. Again in 2012, 2013, they were in there negotiating, advocating, pushing for it. That having been said, I think a couple things have somewhat limited the influence of the business community. One is, I think after 2013, they sort of turned their attention to other priority issues. Business has a lot of issues they need Congress to do, and immigration is just one of them. And like I said, voters don't necessarily have immigration as their top issue. Business doesn't necessarily have immigration as their top issue either. And so I think that other issues have taken precedence. They were active, and I think they have been active in supporting DACA recipients and the DREAM Act, but not in the same level of intensity that, for example, that I saw the business community engage in comprehensive reform. I think they haven't seen another bill that really solves their issues. So they've been working, I think, on smaller things. One thing the business community has been successful in, frankly, is getting more H-2B visas. In the last few years, Congress has authorized the Department of Homeland Security to add extra visas to the cap if the cap is hit. And they've done so, about 15 to 20,000 more visas each year. Those have been tucked into appropriations bills. And I think the business community just finally succeeded in getting Congress to understand how desperate they were for that work. And so the coalition of people working on H-2B visas has been quite successful, kind of working under the radar and getting something done. But I think on some of these broader issues like the Farm Workforce Act, big agricultural and business interests pushing on that significantly. But they haven't been able to get it across the finish line. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that, frankly, the Republican Party, for which the business community has been like a big constituent for many, many years, has kind of moved away from business, right? They've become much more populist. They are equally likely to go after big business as the Democrats maybe used to do. And so business just doesn't have quite the sway they did with the Republican Party. I think that they did, for a lot of the 20th century and the early part of the century. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. The Republican Party has also found grassroots small donor donations. So the business money for their campaigns is not as important as it used to be. That used to be something the Democrats were really good at. Now Republicans can, they can get a lot of those donations as well. So the influence of the business community, I think, has just changed. That having been said, I think they're coming back to it. And I think they're coming back to it for exactly the reason that you said. We are experiencing record low unemployment and record small labor force growth. Now, I work with a lot of economists, and they will tell you very clearly, if your labor force isn't growing, it is very hard for your economy to grow. And the census in 2020 showed the smallest growth in the workforce ever recorded. This last year, there were 11 million job openings, 6.5 million people, unemployed people, to go after 11 million job openings. In spite of what we're seeing, layoffs in the high-tech sector, job growth has continued, but labor force participation, the number of people of working age who are actively seeking work or are working, has slowly declined and hasn't quite come back to pre-COVID levels. The Congressional Budget Office last month put out its projections, its demographic projections through 2040, which it does every year because that's how it assesses the economic or fiscal impact of bills. Partially, it's by looking at what our population is going to look like and how much taxes are going to come in and how much revenue and how much benefits are going to be paid out. And that helps them score legislation for the budget purposes. And they said that by 2042, deaths will exceed births in the United States for the first time ever. And all subsequent population growth will come from immigrants and their children. So that's a pretty stark, and it's not that far away, but that's a pretty stark kind of position to be in. And, the number of people retiring is growing. What they call the old age dependency ratio, which is the ratio of current workers that are supporting current retirees for Social Security and Medicare, is at almost its smallest level ever. So as a country, we have to think about these things, and the business community are the first people to see it, right? They're the first people to see this because they're trying to hire people and having a very difficult time as wages are going up, as benefits are going up, unionization is climbing, all those things that were said to that will entice Americans to go into these jobs. Businesses are doing this, it's happening, and they still don't have enough workforce. And so I think that is driving them back to going after Congress to try to get some immigration reforms to try to address this issue.
Since we're starting to run out of time, we want everybody else to have a chance to ask. Jane, if you don't mind, I'm going to take your last question.
Yes, that's great. And yes, please put questions in the chat, or flag us in the chat, because we want to hear your questions.
So anyway, what I was going to ask then is, what suggestions do you have, Theresa, for the League of Women Voters, for a membership and or advocacy team as we move forward? What are the issues you think we should be addressing, and the possible coalitions that we should be considering joining, many of which we were already joined, but get your ideas.
So I honestly, I think the number one thing I would say that League of Women Voters, and that anybody who's interested in this issue should be doing, is just leaning on their members of Congress to be productive, to do something, to not put something out there that they know nobody on the other side is going to vote for, that the president, like, messaging bills don't help, right? That's I think the biggest thing. We see that both parties have put forward bills that they know the other side is just not going to be on board with. The Democrats tried it last year through that reconciliation process, which didn't require any Republican votes, and they failed miserably. I think Republicans are trying it now, and I think they're going to find that it doesn't help. But we need actual solutions. We need Congress to actually do its job. I mentioned earlier that one of the frustrations about the border is that everything every president has tried to do has ended up in court. Well, the way to answer that is for Congress to pass the law, change the law, and so the administration can do that policy, and then it's defensible in court. Because most of these cases are, oh, the law doesn't allow the administration to do X, so the law doesn't allow the administration to do Y. So Congress changed the law, make the law that can work. Whether it's on the border, whether it's on our legal immigration system, there's lots of reasons. As I said, everything needs fixed right now. There's nothing that's working. So just pick something and work on it, but work on it in a way that's actually likely to be enacted. I would say be reasonable, be rational. That's what's needed. Bombastic demagoguery is not getting us toward a solution. And we're seeing a lot of that. And it's not just limited to one party. I think we have seen, loud activism from a lot of Democrats on legalization. They have, lambasted Republicans as xenophobic and racist. I'm like, that's not a way to get people to sit at a table and agree with each other. And, we have to find a way to have dialogue, to have respectful dialogue across differences, and figure out what's doable, what can we come to agreement on, and what's doable, and be ready to focus on solutions. I find that a lot of members of Congress keep focusing on the problems because, fanning the flames is helpful for them electorally, but again, it's not getting us to solutions. I would say the number one thing I would say is lean on your members to be productive. Don't rely on the talking points of how the other side won't do X or Y. What are you doing to work with them to actually solve the problem? And I hear too much of members of Congress who say, well, I would be happy, but nobody's talking to me. I'm like, well, are you knocking on their door? Like, everybody needs to put some skin in the game, to lean forward and not wait on the other party to come to them.
No, great. There's a number of questions about the border that are in the chat.
Sure.
One is, I'm going to try to lump two together because they're about the border, but one is that you had said that the Bipartisan Policy Center has thought about how to redefine border security. Can you explain a little how you would redefine border security in a way to encourage bipartisan support? And then this follow-up on that is, what would you do to improve the CBP1 process?
Oh, yeah. So I actually wrote a paper. It's called Redefining Border Security, and I'm happy to send a link to you all to share later. It has sort of details of this, but the fundamental idea is that since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, we have merged this idea with immigration enforcement and security into kind of one thing at the border, particularly when we're talking about Border Patrol, and particularly we're talking about CBP. And that made sense, I think, after 9/11. But I think what we're seeing is this merger is making our law enforcement agencies be more in the job of migration management than maybe they should be. So what I am suggesting, the recommendation that we put forward was that we need to get our border security agents back to securing the border and build up another cadre of professionals whose job is to manage the migrants after they arrive. So, the initial encounter should be deciding, is this person a criminal? Are they a threat in some other way? Do they have terrorist ties or whatever? If they are not, if they are simply a migrant looking for work or trying to ask for asylum, then they are transferred as quickly as possible to another place and another cadre of people, not Border Patrol agents, whose job it is then to undertake the immigration process with them, whether that is processing them for expedited removal, whether that is processing them for asylum, whether that is processing them for a case before the immigration court, whatever it is, that's somebody else's job. And our Border Patrol can get back to being on the border. That's the fundamental issue they have right now, is that they are spending their time dealing with migrants and not being on the border. They're not doing what they signed up to do, frankly, which is, as I like to say, catch the bad guys, right? Catch the drug smugglers, catch the people who are trying to evade detection. The people who are turning themselves in, that shouldn't be the Border Patrol's job. One way to manage that and to have that happen is to find ways to reopen ports of entry for asylum. They have been fundamentally closed to asylum, again, since the late part of the Obama administration and throughout the Trump administration. Ports of entry have been basically closed to asylum seekers. One thing that Biden has tried to do is create a way to apply for an appointment at a port of entry through this app called CBP One. I think that is a great start. The problem is that the app is not as good as it could be. There are not enough appointments for the number of people, obviously, who want to come, and capacity is a real issue. So we need to, all of the things that the government has done to try to what they call decompress Border Patrol. Remember, I said arrival of migrants to small Border Patrol stations overwhelmed them. They didn't have places to put them, so they built these other facilities to transport people away from Border Patrol into these other facilities. But if you open up ports of entry for people to apply there, you can just redirect all of that to decompress ports of entry. So when too many people arrive at a port of entry to seek asylum, then the port has facilities for, they have transportation available to take them to a centralized processing center, and they can be processed there, again, by other people, in the government, but not our border agents, right? Like, that's one of the things that we talk about. We do talk about what is needed for border security at the border, and some of that is additional infrastructure. Certainly at ports of entry, we need to rethink how we are looking for drugs and other things that come through ports of entry. And if we're going to have a significant number of asylum seekers, then we need to have capacity, or maybe have particular ports of entry that have capacity to process people that much. We do need to work with Mexico and all our neighbors to the south. One of the things we really need to do is beef up their ability to offer asylum. Many of the migrants we have seen come from Haiti, from Venezuela, even from Cuba, but mostly Haiti and Venezuela, didn't come straight from Haiti or Venezuela. They were living in other countries for quite a while until the conditions in those countries deteriorated, a lot of times due to COVID, and then they started migrating north. So the Haitians, a lot of them had lived in Brazil or other parts of Central America for many years before they started coming north. The Venezuelans, many of them had been resettled in Colombia and other parts of Latin America, and they're now coming north. So we need to work hemispherically with other countries to expand the ability of other countries. But then I think we also need to think seriously about our refugee system, which is ideally where people would apply. We have had a tiny number of refugees allocated for the Western Hemisphere for most of the last 3 decades. The majority of our refugees have come from other parts of the world, mainly Asia and Middle East, not from Latin America. And so we definitely need to expand the capacity to process our regular refugee resettlement in Latin America for people who truly have significant protection claims. And then the last thing we need to do, and it's not really the last thing, it's probably the most important thing, is that we need to resource our adjudicative capacity to meet the need. Our law says that you have the right to apply for asylum. You don't have the right to get it, but you have the right to ask for it. And right now, we don't have the ability to decide whether or not somebody has an asylum claim for years after they arrive. That is way too long. That means they have established themselves in the United States. And if at the end of that time, they don't have a way to stay, our ability to deport them becomes much harder. So we need to, I think, find ways to prioritize border adjudications, maybe create faster ways to do that with due process in places where migrants can have access to humanitarian supports, I've argued that these processing facilities should be multi-agency, and to the extent possible, keep people not in detention, but in, humane conditions while their case can be adjudicated in a rapid way. I think all of these things together would really help, but we need to stop thinking that it's all just under the umbrella of border security, right?
Yeah,
It's
wow.
different things.
We'll have to get your paper. There's a little bit of a follow-up question, which is, could you say something about the new Canada-US immigration policy? And do you think it will send a message to the business community about a possible solution for workforce shortages?
Well, I don't know. So this was, as somebody who has followed US Canada stuff for a very long time, like one of my jobs at the Department of Homeland Security was, I was the attaché of Department of Homeland Security in Ottawa. So I lived in Canada for many years. I worked at DHS on like the return of people under the Safe Third Agreement. Canada has been asking for several years now to extend the Safe Third Agreement that we have with Canada to apply to people who arrive between ports of entry. The United States has for many, many years said, no, we're not interested in doing that because determining when somebody arrived and how through port of entry and whether or not they wanted to seek asylum would be a difficult thing to do. But of course, Canada has seen record numbers of people going north. They had, I think, 40,000 migrants arrive last year, which is a record for them, almost all seeking asylum. So in a tiny microcosm of what we're seeing at our Mexican border, they were seeing from migrants coming north. And so it became a very big political issue for Canada. When President Biden went up there on Friday, he announced that they had come to agreement on expanding the Safe Third Country Agreement between ports of entry. Not only had they come to agreement, but it was going to go into place the following day. Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice had issued regulations that day to go into immediate effect. And they've released a protocol to the Safe Third Agreement that was signed a year ago. So somehow the governments of both Canada and Canada and the United States managed to keep the fact that they had made this agreement secret for a year.
Whoa.
Before implementing it. That to me was the miracle of all of this. So kudos to those governments for doing that. I think there were probably plenty of reasons why they didn't want to publicize this too soon, right? If they weren't able to implement it immediately, and they weren't, because signed agreements take a long time to be able to implement, regulations take a long time to write and be published. It could have encouraged more immigration to happen until it was put in place. And I think that's something that the government has done for a long time. They don't want to telegraph what they're going to do until they're ready to do it, because the announcement without implementation could cause changes or additional migration that's not wanted. So I understand why they do it, but it was a bit of a surprise. Whether or not that will affect the business community, I think right now, no, because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about asylum seekers going between the ports of entry. I think that, though, that the business community in the United States, frankly, I think our politicians need to wake up to the fact that our immigration problems, legal immigration problems, are benefiting Canada. There was a study that colleagues of mine at the Niskanen Center did looking at the Canadian Express Entry Program, which is their program for skilled workers. 45,000 Canadian Express Entry invitations last year were granted to foreign nationals who had studied and graduated from the United States. So those are people who came to the United States to study, got their degree, and either were unable to find a way to stay in the United States through an employer sponsor, or saw how hard it was and didn't bother, and instead went to Canada and got their resident status in Canada very quickly. That is Canada taking advantage of our problems. And I love my Canadian friends. My husband is Canadian, but they're eating our lunch, and I don't like that. And we should do better. We should absolutely do better. And I think both employer community and I think our policymakers have to wake up to this reality.
I see two questions that off the chat that I want to pose Theresa. One is they're both dealing with with refugee and also other types of forced migration.
Mhm.
So one is from Kim Reed. She's asking what more can we do on a bipartisan basis to help those countries people are fleeing. And then I was going to ask, but I felt we were running out of time, a similar question on the other side, and that's really what can we do to make our refugee resettlement system function again to admit people as part of the durable solutions for people who really need to get out of harm's way.
Yeah.
Mm.
You know, President Biden came into office talking a lot about root causes of migration. And that's how he was going to manage the migration of the border, was to tackle the root causes. And he assigned Vice President Harris to deal with this. She was not assigned to fix the border. That's a misnomer. She was assigned to deal with the root causes of migration, particularly from Central America. And over the course of the last couple of years, I think there have been some successes. Certainly, they have announced a lot of business investment in those countries to try to help the economic conditions. But I think some of the reasons that people are fleeing, yes, it's economic, but it's also endemic corruption, autocracy, gang violence that the country is unable or unwilling to corral. I think there's a lot of reasons that people are fleeing these countries. And the other thing to just recognize is that, you know, dealing with all of those root causes is not a quick fix. It's a long-term strategy. Absolutely, we should be doing more in our hemisphere to help our neighbors do better, because that will help us. I think we haven't necessarily paid as much attention to our own backyard in recent years. There's been a lot going on in other parts of the world, but we need to re-engage with all of the countries of the hemisphere and listen to them about what they need and what they want and how the United States can help them. You know, we have a kind of mixed history when it comes to our dealings with Latin America. I think sometimes we have come in not the best ways historically, and I think we have to acknowledge that. So we have to come in partnership rather than sort of demanding. But, you know, development and addressing, you know, democratic rule and rule of law and all of those things that help people feel like they can stay and live where their countries are, those are hard. They're hard in their long-term prospects. So it's absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient, at least not to deal with what we're dealing with right now. And I think the bigger issue is that, you know, our asylum and refugee criteria are really quite narrow. And a lot of these people, even though they're fleeing terrible circumstances, don't necessarily meet the criteria under law to be considered a refugee or asylee. And we don't really have a lot of other ways for them to come to the United States if that's where they want to come. One of the things that we've been talking to the administration about and others have been talking about is actually expanding availability of work visas, even temporary work visas. Is that another way that people can at least come for a period of time, can earn some money, and that can help stabilize positions of people at home? It's not an answer for everybody, but it might be an answer for some. And then what other things can we look to? Obviously, I talked about our refugee resettlement system. That process takes a while. It takes about 2 years on average. And as you mentioned, under the Trump administration, they reduced the refugee admission ceiling so low that the entire refugee resettlement community, all the nonprofits, the State Department that runs it, Health and Human Services that administers it, all lost funding and therefore cut staff, closed offices. And even though they have a goal of resettling a lot more people this year, the president, I think it's currently 125,000 that President Biden wants to settle, we're not even going to get half of that this year. It takes a long time to rebuild that capacity. They just announced this private sponsorship program called Welcome Corps. I think that's a really great way to expand the capacity. We have to see how well it works. It's new. And And it's asking individuals and groups or organizations to directly help and sponsor the resettlement of a refugee or a refugee family. That job has traditionally been done by 9 national nonprofit refugee resettlement agencies that are very good and have a lot of capacity, but we're trying to tap into sort of the broader American welcoming spirit, frankly, to do this. And I think it started with the Afghan program, Uniting for Ukraine, which was a domestic sponsorship program. And I think they saw how many Americans were willing to step up. And this is a kind of thing that's been done in Canada for many, many years. Other countries have done private sponsorships. The United States used to do private sponsorships before the Refugee Act went into effect. So we're kind of going back to our roots here. And hopefully that will allow for some expanded capacity, but it's new and it's still getting off the ground, and we'll see how well it works over time. But I think those are good efforts.
Theresa, you've just been talking so brilliantly for a very long time. Susan, I'm going to sort of defer to you if you think there's another question we should cover.
I don't see it on the board, and I think we've pretty much covered the questions that we came up with, or directly or indirectly. Maybe just a word though, Theresa, on Mexico and what the Mexican elections cycle is going to mean in terms of relations with the U.S. on immigration issues.
Yeah, it's very
that also.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see the evolution. So one of the things the United States has been doing, particularly under the Trump and Biden administrations, is relying very heavily on Mexico to help manage migration at the border, starting with President Trump and the migrant protection protocols, where he sort of invade upon Mexico to take back non-Mexicans and allow them to stay while their cases were pending in the United States, to the implementation of Title 42, the CDC order that expelled migrants without the opportunity to apply for asylum, that the Biden administration is now saying they will end by May. But Mexico agreed again to take back non-Mexicans, mostly Central Americans under that. Only recently did Mexico agree to take back Venezuelans in October, along with the parole program, and then Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans in January of this year, along with those new parole programs. I would say that, the Trump administration sort of pressed upon Mexico to do more enforcement at its southern border with the threat of tariffs. So he was definitely much more sort of aggressive in his negotiations with Mexico, but Mexico went along. I think their president, I think some would say he has a similar kind of personality and outlook to President Trump. I'm sure he wasn't thrilled at the threat of tariffs, but I think personally they kind of shared a similar political notion, how they acted in their politics. With President Biden, I think it's been a more traditional kind of negotiation in foreign policy realm. The Biden administration has been willing to be a lot more critical of some of the things that the Mexican government is doing on democracy and journalists and dealing with the drug cartels. And I think that's not made the Mexican president very happy. That having been said, it's also in his interest to help the United States with migration, not the least of which is the Mexican public is starting to kind of turn against the idea of all these migrants sort of going through its territory and them having to deal with it. So I think he finds political advantage in this. And he's also using it probably to get some other things from the United States. I think there's a little bit of leverage. He's got more leverage because we're relying on Mexico so much. I think that's a challenge, frankly. I think it's not necessarily in the United States' interest to ask Mexico to be our interdiction state for migrants. I think the European Union tried to do that with the Middle Eastern refugees through Turkey. And I think they found that was a difficult bargain to maintain. And eventually Turkey said, yeah, we're not keeping everybody here anymore and let them through. So I think we need to consider alternative ways of managing migration. I think it does need to be cooperative with other countries, but I think we can't continue to ask Mexico to just take people back. I think that there's going to be a limit to that. As you mentioned, Mexico allows its presidents only one term in office, and this president is up in 2024, and that's the same year we have a presidential election. That hasn't happened, I think, since President Bush and Vicente Fox were elected in 2000. So it's a unique opportunity when both countries will be picking new leaders to see what happens. I think it's going to be interesting, but I think, for the United States to continue to rely so heavily on Mexico, I think we need to come up with some other options that we can do in the event that the Mexican government decides to change its mind about its cooperation. I don't think we have a lot of good alternatives right now.
It'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think we should just thank you. I couldn't have imagined better. You've covered so much and have had so much experience and great insights for us. So I thank you again and again. And we're getting wonderful positive comments in the chat. I just wanted to say to the broader group that the steering committee for the League Immigration Interest Group is working away. We're going to be meeting with the U.S. advocacy team tomorrow, actually, to brainstorm with them. We're encouraging people to talk about immigration at conventions, and we do plan to have another general meeting like this before the summer, but no specifics as of yet. Susan, any final words from you?
No, just to thank everyone for joining us, and then particularly to thank Theresa for an absolutely fantastic discussion of these really, really difficult issues. It's I can't express more than I could try as to how important it is to have centrists talking about immigration issues. That used to be fairly much the norm when Ted Kennedy and Alan Simpson could work together on developing legislation. But right now there are so few people who are advocates for immigration reform who are willing to think about how to balance competing interests. And Theresa has been one of those few people for many, many years. And I really appreciate your coming and talking with us.
Thanks so much. I just put in the chat a link to our website. You can find a lot more of the bipartisan work, and we do a podcast every couple of weeks. So if you haven't heard enough of me talking, we call it This Week in Immigration. If you just search for it on whatever platform you pull your podcast down, you can find it. Our latest episode should be up tomorrow, and we talk about the budget and appropriations process for immigration. So if you want to find out how that works, take a listen.
And could we find your Redefining Border Security article?
It's on that website, but I will send that. I will send that direct link to that to you guys afterwards, so you can disseminate that.
Great. We're going to have to get you back. Thank you. Thank you to everyone. Go have dinner or go relax. And thanks to you all. And we'll keep on talking.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Have a great day.
Thanks.
Take care.